Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of GW's Graduate School of Education and Human Development Virtual Preview Day. We are so glad you're joining us for today's masterclass. As you may know, the Graduate School of Education and Human Development is one of 14 different schools at the George Washington University. We offer a variety of programs that focus on areas such as special education, organizational leadership, counseling, education policy, and teacher preparation, to name a few. Whether your program is offered at our main campus in downtown Washington, D.C., or our Northern Virginia locations, or online, our students are all part of a robust academic community of scholar practitioners. Today, we are joined by Dr. Lionel Howard, who will be sharing a masterclass on positionality, subjectivity, and social location. Dr. Howard is the chair of our Educational Leadership Department, where he also serves as a faculty member. As a professor, Dr. Howard teaches in our Education PhD program, as well as research methods courses across the school. After the presentation, we will host a Q&A session. Throughout the class, please feel free to type your questions into the chat box or utilize the Q&A feature, both of which are located at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Howard, thank you for joining us today. I'll let you get started now.
Great, thank you, Kimberly, for the wonderful introduction. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to. So this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about positionality, subjectivity, social location, and thinking about the implication of these constructs for research, practice, and policy. And just to give you a brief outline of the presentation, I'm going to start by asking you to consider who you are or who we are. Then I'm going to introduce you to some grounding terminology, specifically subjectivity, positionality, and social location, and then offer some perspective as to why these concepts matter, and then allow some space for us to think about what we should be considering as we move forward as it pertains to these constructs. So I know you can't see each other or see me for that matter, but I want you to privately acknowledge who you are as I go through the next set of slides. I'm going to be introducing you to just different perspectives and experiences that might resonate in your own biography. So first, raise your hand or privately acknowledge if you like Starbucks coffee, or if you like Wawa's coffee. Maybe you're from the Northeast and you have Wawa's in your area, you might prefer that coffee. Acknowledge or raise your hand if you like Peet's coffee, or if you like Dunkin' Donuts coffee. Or maybe you're not a coffee fan at all, you just prefer tea. The good thing is we have all of these beverage options at GW. Privately acknowledge or raise your hand if you attended a small high school, or if you attended a large comprehensive high school. Acknowledge if you attended a public school, or if you attended a private school, or maybe you were homeschooled. Acknowledge if you are a first-generation college student, or an international student, specifically meaning that all of your primary and high school education was done outside of the US context. Or if you identify as a differently abled student. Acknowledge if you are a parent student, or if you are a veteran student. Acknowledge if you are a former or current school teacher, Or perhaps you are a school administrator, either within a school or at the district level. Or if you are part of the professional staff of a school, acknowledge if you are coming from the policy world, or if you come from a research institute or research think tank. So why do these and other like questions matter? Thinking about the different experiences that we've had, where we come from, how we identify, what we prefer, and what this all means for the work that we do within the context of education. Like most universities and colleges, we are introduced to a wide range of individuals who have varied backgrounds. And we all end up in graduate education classes together, talking about problems of practice, talking about policy, talking about research. And oftentimes, our biography, our perspectives, our experiences, our preferences become the prisms through which we engage within the learning process. In the research literature, this prism is framed in multiple ways. You may be familiar with the concept of subjectivity, which refers specifically to how a person's, refers to a person's feelings and their beliefs and the desires that they embody. And oftentimes when we think about subjectivity, it is often framed as personal opinion, which is in contrast to what we would call knowledge or justified belief. Sometimes subjectivity can be framed in the negative to discredit one's engagement with context. Other times it can be a lens through which you can draw on important experiential insight. In addition to subjectivity, we have the construct positionality. And this construct really tries to get at asking, who are you and where do you stand in relationship to others? Others being populations that you might be serving through your practice, others being those who might be affected by the policies that you're engaging, others might be the people who show up in your research projects. So where do you stand in relationship to these individuals, or these communities, or these groups? Are you a part of that dominant discourse? Are you a part of the subordinate or the subjugated group? Are you marginal to that population or that topic? Are you at the center of it? Are you empowered within the context of that work? Are you part of the powerless? And maybe your positionality slides across those two ends. Maybe you serve in a dominant space in some capacities, but are in subordinate spaces in others. The ideal here is that positionality is not static. It's fluid and it's contextual, and it can be moving as you sort of shift across context. In addition to subjectivity, positionality, we have what we call social location. And social location are all your social identity markers. And this can include your race, your ethnicity, your class, your gender, your sexual orientation or identity, your religion, your physical ability, and any other social categories that you are a part of. Oftentimes, we'll talk about social location in the context of one or more of these identity markers. Increasingly, we appreciate that people show up in very complex ways. So we talk about this notion of intersectionality, the ideal that race, ethnicity, class, gender, et cetera, are all functioning at the same time. And one's experiences of the world are as complicated as those different attributes are together as a whole. So all of those questions that I asked you earlier to affirm for yourself, whether it was the school type you attended, your preference for coffee or tea or types of coffees, whether you identify as a first generation or a veteran student. But all of these experiences and perspectives tie into these three categories of subjectivity, positionality, and social location. So why do these questions and these concepts matter? Well, first, they allow you to understand who you are. And oftentimes we're not provided an opportunity to really engage how our biographies shape how we engage in education enterprise. But through paying attention to one's subjectivity, one's positionality, and one's social location, you can really elevate the work that you're doing. So it helps you understand who you are demographically, but also philosophically and ideology. And this is important because this can come out in the context of the classroom when you're talking about different theories or different ideas. And we all have different frames from which we're drawing on. But it's also a chance for you to really begin to unpack your socialization and those experiences and what that might mean for your work. It allows you to think about the ways in which your personal and your professional experiences inform your interests, inform the work you desire to do post your graduate experience. It also highlights your values and your belief systems, which can have great implications for the work that you'll do. It can also surface the assumptions that we hold about ourselves and about others as we engage in the education experience. Understanding who we are and what we bring to the education enterprise has significant implications for our work within the context of research. This insight or this personal insight can really be instructive towards thinking about the kind of research you might engage. It certainly can inform the kinds of research questions that you take up. It can also inform how you think about the design of research in terms of what's legitimate research or what's knowledge and what's not. But even the methodological orientation towards research can be informed by those experiences that you've had. They have implication for practice. How you think about pedagogy, if you're in a teacher education program or if you're in a training program, is certainly informed by those personal and professional experiences, what you value, what you believe, the philosophical orientations that you orient around, your ideology. Also can affect the curriculum choices that you make. Or if you're in the clinical program, thinking about how your treatment modalities might be determined, what you see as more appropriate treatment approaches for clients, or even your techniques of offering therapy or counseling or support. And then from the policy standpoint, thinking about implementation, how do we sort of translate policy into practice, or how do we implement policy at different levels, and how that can be informed by what we value, what we believe, or the philosophies that we hold. These constructs also have implications for policy in and of itself, how policy is developed and articulated, and certainly how policy is analyzed. How do these experiences shape our analysis of policy or our participation in the articulation or the development of policy? So some would argue that we come to our work in the education enterprise and we should be coming into this work with a very open, objective standpoint. I like to argue that that's nearly impossible. We all have had great experiences professionally. We have a deep biography of our own personal experiences in the context of education that certainly inform the work that we're doing. And it's nearly impossible to suspend those experiences and that knowledge as we engage in the education enterprise. So what I like to offer is that it's important to surface those perspectives, those belief systems, those values, and pay attention to them because they might be able to help you, but also can create blind spots in the work that you're trying to do to address problems within education. And so I like to say, let's sort of acknowledge and let's sort of think about what that might mean for the work we're doing versus the perspective of we are able to hold this objective sort of standpoint. And this is largely a tribute to my own personal training as a former statistician who is now doing mostly ethnographic research, where I'm sort of thinking about knowledge creation, knowledge generation in a different kind of frame. So as you move forward within the context of your own training or your own work beyond the graduate school, there's a couple of questions that I'd like for you to think about or to consider. One is, think about the various identities that you bring to the work in the field of education. Think about your own values and your own belief system. And even within the context of the different identity markers that you hold. And you can think about these constructs being generated across sort of a socialization spectrum, right? So we learn from our families and our communities and through our experiences. And at each phase of our education, we're likely exposed to a lot more information, new information that might even challenge some of these belief systems, but really paying attention to how they are showing up in the context of the work that you're doing. Thinking about the implications for identity. So in my own work, I think about the ways in which race functions and my own experiences as an African-American man and what that means for how I think about the education of students of color or marginalized students, but also students who have had similar education backgrounds as myself. It also allows me to sort of challenge my assumptions that I might hold about the experiences of those students. Think about how your experiences are going to shape the work in the field of education. So how has your previous experiences informed your work, or how would they inform your work within the field of education? Again, many of us come to graduate education because we really see the need to address problems within education. And so we see this as an opportunity to extend our knowledge, our skill set, to then later go back and address those problems. And so that interest, that drive is motivated by sometimes professional and personal experiences. So paying attention to what those experiences are, and then what that might mean for how you engage in the education enterprise. And I would also say that you might think about the ways in which your experiences can help you make sense of the content that you're exposed to in your graduate education, and to sort of wrestle with some new ideas that may be presented to you, but also may even be affirming experiences that you have witnessed or have engaged in your own education. So thinking about your identity, thinking about your experiences, all ties back to those three constructs of subjectivity, social location, and positionality. And those three constructs are often used sometimes interchangeably, depending on the source that you're reading, but they really are unique in their own ways. Again, the subjectivity really ties to the beliefs and the values and the perspectives that you hold, and oftentimes get framed as opinion versus objective knowledge. Whereas positionality is about where are you standing in relationship to the others, or even the topics that you are studying. Are you an insider? Are you an outsider? Are you marginal? Are you in the center? Right? And then again, your social location. How does your social identity markers sort of show up in the context of the work that you are doing? So I'm going to pause there and open up some space for questions and answers about the ideas that I presented to you.
Thank you, Dr. Howard, for that wonderful presentation. Now is the time for Q&A, which is going to be facilitated by my colleague, Holly. Turn the reins over to you.
Sorry. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Howard, for the presentation. If you could type any questions that you have in the chat function or in the Q&A function, I will go ahead and read them out loud for Dr. Howard. But we do have a first question that came to us through a private chat, and that is, how could these themes, Dr. Howard, apply to a K-12 classroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how do we sort of think about those three constructs, social location, subjectivity, and personality, within the context of the K-12 classroom? I'm assuming the question may be coming from someone who may be a teacher in the classroom. If that's the case, those questions might help you think about the curriculum that you are offering to the students, right? So most of the time, our curriculum choices are made by the district, right? And so we might not have as much flexibility to expand what that curriculum exposure is, but there might be spaces for you to think about what are the ways in which I may be privileging particular types of curriculum, and does that curriculum allow for engagement across a wider sort of body of students that you are teaching or providing instruction for? So thinking about that from a curriculum standpoint, but also thinking about the ways in which we think about the adult-child relationship, right? And sort of how we think about power within the context of the classroom. So that might be that positionality piece. So as the lead instructor, the teacher, you hold a certain authority within the classroom. So how do you then think about how students might be experiencing you through instruction? Do you sort of create the space for a student-centered approach to your pedagogy? So it can show up in that kind of way. But also around the social identity markers. If you're working in a school where the students don't necessarily have the same background or same identity markers as you might be paying attention to the ways in which those dynamics may be playing out in very subtle or sometimes very pronounced ways. Or even how we engage student interaction, right? Do we sort of find ourselves, if we are male teachers, privileging male students' voice in the classroom, right? Or do we create a space for our girls and our young ladies to sort of engage in the same way? So really sort of paying attention to those aspects too, but also our own school experiences, right? If we went to a largely suburban high school space and we're working in an urban context, we might have some different challenges in making those adjustments. Either we become really aware of those differences and see it as an opportunity to sort of do really imaginative work, or we don't sort of acknowledge it and it creates a little bit of a tension or a challenge within the instructional dynamic.
Thank you. So another question is about quantitative research and how you can look at your identity through specific numbers that usually are a little bit less subjective.
That's a great question. That's a question that I get often. How do these concepts apply to quantitative research or survey of mixed methods research? And one very clear area where these concepts can have application is in the translation of the research findings, right? So when we think about, for example, within statistics, we might say that there's a significant sort of finding, right, that we have seen empirically through the data. So think about, how are you interpreting that finding, right? How are you sort of thinking about what that might mean for policy or for practice or even for new research questions, right? And as you're thinking about that translation, if you will, what are you privileging, right? How are you sort of showing up based on your own biography or your own professional or personal experiences that might color or inform how you then translate the research? And so I think that's an area that we don't often talk about, is the translation piece and thinking about the implications of that work. So you could be using these constructs to help you really thinking about what's a more appropriate, if you will, or perhaps a more instructive way of translating those statistical findings into actual meaningful sort of ideas for the population of interest. So for example, you might think about, like, who are the sample participants, right? What is the larger context within which the data was collected or gathered, right? And then sort of using that as a way of helping you translate the findings, but also thinking about, well, how am I potentially overstating or understating the importance of something based on my own experiences or based on what I expected to see in the research findings.
The next question is, one of the slides that you referenced earlier pulled where we all came from. How do you think an international student would be able to navigate these constructs given that the context has now shifted greatly? And how can we advocate or empower them?
Well, that's a great question, right? And so I think that's something that I'm just starting to think about through this international perspective, and actually in my own work in the past year, having the opportunity to work in international spaces. And so I do think that this notion of subjectivity, positionality, and social location can be framed as particular to a US or Western context, in ways that other countries don't sort of talk about these sort of identity markers or these ideas within the context of research, practice, and policy. So I'll give you an example. So I recently did some work in the Netherlands, and I was doing some work that was looking at race equity. And within the US context, we talk about race. We don't always do it well, right? But we make a go at it. We have some language to help us have those conversations. Well, when I was working with my colleagues in the Netherlands at two universities there wasn't this sort of same language to sort of talk about race, right? And they sort of framed it differently, talked about it in the context of Dutch nationals, Western migrants, and then other migrants. And that was a way of sort of stratifying around what we would in the US think of as race ethnicity, right? More around national identity. And so there wasn't this sort of same language. So students coming to the US would be confronted with these as very sometimes stark and new constructs, right? And may not have had opportunity to really engage what that might mean for how they experience their education within our system. And so oftentimes when I'm having those discussions with international students, it's oftentimes sort of helping them sort of see, like, here's the ways in which this can sort of illuminate an understanding, right? But also here's how they can get in the way of understanding too. So I think like that translation piece can be a little more work depending on what their exposure is. And that's not so different than the US, depending on where you sort of have grown and where you have sort of existed. But certainly the language is certainly the constructs aren't necessarily universal in that kind of way.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. The next question is, as a teacher, how do we remain cognizant of our students' learning needs based on their identities when they are still discovering their own intersectionality?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a question I get often, actually from parents too, right, who are trying to support their children. I should disclose that I'm trained as a developmental psychologist. I think about adolescent and child development, specifically the ways in which schools function as a developmental space, right? And so this question is very important. And so one of the things that I like to encourage is thinking about how do we offer a plurality of perspective to young people as they're engaging in their own development and learning, right? It's very easy, or it can be very sometimes commonplace to sort of create very sort of static ideas or constructs for them to engage with, but how do we sort of open that up in ways that, one, feels developmental, right? But also that respects that children's backgrounds and their home life may offer differing ideas about what's appropriate, what's not, right? And so really trying to think about what's the balance of sort of a wider lens exposure, but also being mindful of that they're also engaging in learning development outside of the classroom that may be countering ideas that we're offering them. So I think there's trying to think about a wider exposure, a wider set of curriculum or pedagogy, or even sort of conversation that happens in the classroom. I often try to use myself as an example. I feel like that takes the pressure off of the student to sort of talk about my own sort of biography and the ways in which I've had to navigate my identities that I hold, but also really sort of talking about those missteps. Like, here's where I was sort of struggling to sort of understand this dynamic, but here are the questions that I was able to ask myself and others to sort of progress through that. So I think you demonstrating some of the complexity and making it clear that they don't have to have a solution or that there is one way of being, but that this is a dynamic, ongoing process, and we will sort of gain understanding, will be challenged in particular ways. Some things will resonate, some things won't, but that might help you sort of progress in a way that students can feel supported and they can develop in ways that allow them to feel whole.
As a higher education administrator, how can we help contribute towards making schools more accessible and equitable?
Yeah, I think we have to listen to the students and what they need. And I'll give you a good example. Recently, we held a dissertation boot camp for our doctoral students. And we had a student who had particular learning needs. And we did not do a good job, right? We did not do a good job of being responsive to what that student very clearly communicated she needed to participate fully in this camp. And I think even our best efforts sometimes fall short. So what I'm learning is that we have to talk to the students. We have to really get a sense of what's going to help you to be most successful within this context, but also be very transparent about the scope of our resources to actualize or support whatever those needs are, right? Because I don't always necessarily know what is needed, right? I have some idea, but someone who has lived that experience is certainly more insightful. And so I think really creating a space for students to say, here's what we need. Here's how you can support me be successful in this endeavor.
Thank you. So the next question is, I think our personality also defines how we treat results of an investigation. Therefore, is it necessary to stay as objective as possible? Any recommendations to achieve this?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that you could do to maintain, well, let me say this. I think there's some researchers, practitioners, policy folks who certainly stand in the camp of, I need to be objective, right? Which is another way of saying I need to be sort of value-free within my interpretation or my use of these concepts, right? And so I think that's a very difficult space to hold. So one thing you can do is to really be reflective of about, you know, how your personality, how your experiences are shaping your interpretation. And so one of the things that I like to do is, if I'm going to be translating some of my research into practice, I'll spend some time thinking about, okay, how does this resonate in my own professional experiences? And what might I be privileging or downplaying in my interpretation of that work? So really doing this additional sort of side work, if you will, to really sort of understand what may be driving that interpretation, right? So that you can get closer to the lived experience or the truth or objectivity of the other person by really monitoring how you're showing up within this work. And so really being reflective of the practice of your own biography and thinking about that in very intentional ways. And this is hard work, right? Because we don't necessarily create the space to do that. We sometimes just move through the work. We often are under great constraints to move things forward, and there may not be, you know, a sufficient time to allow for that reflection. But I think if you're able to do that, I think it can help you get closer to quote unquote objectivity. Oh, then I also will say too, like talking to other people, right? And I always make the joke in class that my ideas are great, right? I'm brilliant. And it's not until I talk to my contemporaries and they make me aware of where I may be overstating or understating ideas, right? Because I just can't see it because of who I am, right? But someone else outside can sort of say, hey, have you thought about these ideas? Have you thought about it from this frame? And so I think that's another way to get at that, to sort of manage the ways in which our positionality is sort of showing up or our social identities are showing up in the work that we're doing.
Great. So the next question is, in my training within the ESOL community, I learned that it is important to research and study the backgrounds of students from their diverse countries. This way, we make our classroom more well-rounded during instruction. What is your take on this, and do you think this technique could be effective, and why?
Yeah, I do think there is some value in making a really concerted effort to understand who's in your classroom, right? And that may be you as the instructor or teacher doing some of that research to understand the context in which students are coming, or just creating a space for students to share that, right? Sort of talk about who they are. So the same kinds of questions that I introduced in this presentation, like asking students, who are you? Tell us about who you are, what your experiences are, so we can all understand that context, because that context then does drive how one participates in the learning process, right? And so I think we can create a space for that. So I do see a great value in that. And actually in my own classes, I ask students to sort of think about and share with me, like, who are you? What are your personal experiences? What's your background? Because that does show up in our discussions in the classroom. It shows up in how we interpret the readings that I assign. It shows up in how people take up the assignments for assessment in the classroom. And so if you can create a space for that, I think it can go very far. I think you have to also be able to help other people to hold space for people who have very different life experiences, right? And I think that can be a challenge at times, especially if they are very diametrically opposed, or people just aren't willing to sort of be open to the different ways in which people sort of show up in the classroom or how they get to be where they are. But creating space for that, certainly.
Dr. Howard, you mentioned that you come from a psychology background. How do you bring in your background to an education field, especially because a lot of our students don't have education backgrounds but are trying to get into the field?
Yeah, so I occupy a very unique space in that my training was in a graduate school of education, but I did my postdoc in a psych department, which was a radically different training and experience. And so, but I always wanted to sort of work in the intersection of education and psychology. And so what I've been able to do is sort of think about how the developmental field of psychology sort of function within the context of education. And so I wanted to sort of think about, well, how are schools serving as a space where young people develop beyond just sort of cognitive or sort of content knowledge, but how do they sort of become to know who they are within the school context, given the amount of time we spend in schools, right? And sort of what happens in school. And so I was able to sort of think about it in those kinds of bridging ways. What I would also say too is that I spent a lot of time in my professional world working in schools, but not in the traditional way. So I worked at a community college as a tutor for a number of years, solely on the academic side, but was thinking about, well, how do students experience anxiety in the context of learning, right? And so I was meeting students who were very anxious around math classes, right? So they have like math phobia, sort of math anxiety. So there's this other component that happens within the learning process that allowed me to sort of see those connections. So I would say that if you're someone who is not working in the field of education, you're making the transition into education, think about the ways in which those experiences prior to might help you think about how you might engage in education enterprise, right? So it could be on the learning side, it could be even on sort of how we think about research or new kinds of questions. So I think there's opportunities to do that. I think as a field, education is quite broad. And so there's a lot of ways in which you can enter into the field itself. I think that answers your question. Hopefully it does.
Excellent, Dr. Howard. We're going to go ahead and wrap up now. So I thank you all for joining us one more time. And Dr. Howard, thank you so much for answering our questions and giving a great lecture. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation. And I hope to meet some of you in person when you arrive to campus. So thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. We hope to see you at some of our other events this week. Have a great rest of your day.